Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where secrets lie as thick as the Devon fog. Our tale unfolds at the Weary Wanderer, a lonely inn huddled against the vast, brooding expanse of Dartmoor. Here, on a night when mist has swallowed the world whole, a simple pub game is about to take a deadly turn. Stranded by the weather, a handful of locals and visitors will find that the most dangerous foe is not the howling moor, but the company they keep. Chapter 1. The fog, my dear reader, is a most deceptive thing. It can soften the harshest edges of the landscape, transforming a gnarled oak into a spectral sentinel, and a humble granite tor into a castle of myth. But it can also conceal, pressing in with a wet, silent intimacy, blurring the lines between safety and peril. On that particular Tuesday evening in late October, the fog that rolled over Dartmoor was of the latter variety. A thick, chilling blanket that had crept up from the bogs and swaledills to smother the world in a uniform, featureless grey. It deadened sound, stole the light, and effectively turned the Weary Wanderer, an inn that had stood sentinel on its lonely crossroads for 3 centuries, into an island adrift in a ghostly sea. Inside, however, a determined battle was being waged against the gloom. A great fire roared in the hearth, its flames casting a boisterous, dancing light over the dark wooden beams and polished brasses. The air was thick with the comforting aromas of roasting meat, pipe tobacco, and spilled ale, the holy trinity of the English public house. It was darts night, a ritual as sacred to the inn's patrons as evensong at the parish church. Yet one must always be wary of rituals, for they can breed a dangerous sense of complacency. One assumes that because a thing has always been done a certain way, it shall continue to be so. A fatal assumption, as events would shortly prove. I, Miss Elena Vance, had taken up a position of strategic advantage in a wing-backed chair by the fire, my knitting needles clicking with a placid rhythm that belied the active workings of my mind. A holiday on the moors had been prescribed for my nerves, though I have always found the observation of human nature far more restorative than any amount of bracing air. And the small, trapped company at the Weary Wanderer provided a most fascinating study. There was Major Alastair Finch, late of His Majesty's Indian Army, a man so ramrod straight it seemed a plumb line had been permanently affixed to his spine. He stood by the oche, the throwing line, his face a mask of concentration, his silver-tufted eyebrows knitted together. He treated the game of darts not as a pastime, but as a military campaign requiring precision, discipline, and an unwavering contempt for the enemy. At present, the enemy was Arthur Pumble. Mr. Pumble was a man cast in a rather different mould. Fleshy, florid, and draped in expensive tweed that sat uneasily on his broad frame, he was a recent and unwelcome addition to the local landscape. Having acquired the old Blackwood estate with a great deal of London money, he conducted himself with the belligerent certainty of a man who believes his wallet makes him king. He laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, and possessed a sneer that could curdle milk. "Come now, Major," he boomed, his voice slicing through the companionable murmur of the room. "Put your back into it. It's a pub game, not a parade ground inspection." The Major's lips thinned. He drew back his arm, a machine of controlled force, and released the dart. It flew with a satisfying thwack, embedding itself precisely in the triple 20. A ripple of polite applause went through the room. The Major, however, took no notice, his gaze fixed on Pumble with an expression of profound distaste. Seated at a small, sticky table nearby was Mr. Gregory Shaw, a man whose suit was a shade too sharp, his smile a fraction too wide. He was a businessman, a developer, and he had been locked in what appeared to be a most disagreeable conversation with Pumble earlier in the evening. His fingers now drummed a nervous tattoo on the tabletop, his eyes darting between Pumble and the door, as if calculating the odds of a profitable venture or a hasty escape. Across the room, huddled in a corner as if for protection, was a splash of vibrant colour in the otherwise earthy tones of the pub. This was Miss Lillian Croft, a young artist from Chelsea, all flowing scarves and tragic eyes. She'd announced to anyone who would listen, come to Dartmoor to capture its raw, untamed soul. At present, her sketchbook lay open, but her charcoal was still. She watched the proceedings with a wide-eyed, almost fearful intensity. She had the look of a startled fawn, sensing a predator in the undergrowth. Behind the bar, Mr. and Mrs. Gable, the proprietors, moved with a strained and weary choreography. Silas Gable was a gaunt, stooping man, his face etched with the permanent worry of a publican trying to make ends meet in a desolate location. His wife, Beatrice, was a bird-like creature, constantly wiping down the already gleaming counter, her movements quick and jerky, her gaze flitting about the room as if she expected one of the horse brasses to suddenly take flight. And then there was Thomas Weaver, the sheep farmer. He was a man who seemed to have been hewn from the moor itself, craggy, weathered and silent. He sat nursing a pint of stout, his sheepdog curled at his feet, his eyes smouldering with a deep ancestral resentment. Pumble had recently purchased a tract of land that bordered Weaver's own, and the matter of a certain stream, vital for Weaver's flock, had been the subject of a short, brutal argument not half an hour before. "That stream has watered Weaver land for 200 years, the farmer had growled, his voice low and dangerous. Pumble had merely laughed. "Deeds are deeds, my good man, get a lawyer. Or better yet, teach your sheep to drink my excellent bottled water. I might even sell it to you at a discount." Finally, weaving between the tables with an inexhaustible supply of good cheer, was Mr. Desmond Cole, a travelling salesman. He was a portly, jovial fellow with a pink, perspiring face and a ready joke for every occasion. He seemed to know everyone and everything, a human gazette of local gossip. "Another bullseye for the Major," he chirped. "The man could shoot the pips from a playing card at 50 paces, I reckon. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary. A pub game, a collection of locals, a bit of ill feeling, nothing more, you might say. But when human passions are confined within 4 walls, with the elements themselves sealing the exits, the ordinary has a habit of becoming quite extraordinary indeed." The final match of the evening was between the Major and Pumble. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken animosity. Pumble, fueled by brandy, was playing with a galling, almost preternatural luck, his randomly flung darts finding their marks with infuriating consistency. The Major, in contrast, was growing increasingly rigid, his precision undermined by his visible fury. It was Pumble's turn to throw for the match. He needed a double 16 to win. He swaggered to the oche, a fat cigarillo clamped between his teeth. "Watch and learn, old boy," he slurred at the Major. He drew his arm back, a clumsy, lurching movement. And at that precise moment, the lights in the inn gave a sickening flicker, buzzed violently and died. The darkness was absolute, a sudden, shocking plunge into a blackness as total as the bottom of a well. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by Mrs. Gable's thin scream. "The generator," Silas Gable's voice grunted from behind the bar. "Hold on, everyone." There was a fumbling sound, a muttered curse. The seconds stretched out, each one filled with the uneasy shuffling of unseen feet and the rising howl of the wind outside. It was a perfect, disorienting void. One could not even see a hand in front of one's face. Then, with a cough and a sputter, a secondary generator roared to life. A set of emergency lights flickered on, casting a pale, spectral glow over the room. Everyone was standing, blinking in the strange, anemic light. Everyone, that is, except for Arthur Pumble. He was not at the oche. He had stumbled back against a high-backed settle near the fireplace. His head was slumped forward onto his chest, the garish cigarillo having fallen to the floor. For a moment, it seemed as if he had simply passed out from the drink, but then Lillian Croft pointed a trembling finger. "Look," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. From the side of Arthur Pumble's thick neck, protruding at a ghastly angle just below his ear, was a dart. Its shaft was of plain wood, but its flight was a brilliant, almost venomous green. Major Finch, his military training taking over, was the first to move. He strode to Pumble's side and felt for a pulse at the wrist. then at the neck, his fingers avoiding the feathered intruder. He straightened up slowly, his face grim and pale in the emergency lighting. "He's dead," the major announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "Good God, he's been murdered." The howl of the wind outside seemed to answer him, a long, mournful cry. I looked towards the window, where the thick, swirling fog pressed against the glass like a curious spectre. Silas Gable was fumbling with the old-fashioned telephone on the wall, jiggling the receiver hook. "It's no good," he said, his voice trembling. "The line's dead. The storm must have brought a pole down." The truth of our situation descended upon the room with the weight of a shroud. The fog, the storm, the dead phone line, there would be no police, no doctor, no escape. We were trapped. Trapped in the middle of the desolate moor with a corpse, and one must logically conclude with a murderer. My needles, for the first time that evening, fell still in my lap. The game, it seemed, was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Panic, you see, is a remarkably inefficient emotion. It flutters and shrieks and accomplishes very little, rather like a bat trapped in a drawing room. In the immediate aftermath of the Major's pronouncement, the inn was filled with just such a chaotic energy. Mrs. Gable descended into quiet hysterics. Gregory Shaw began pacing like a caged wolf, and Thomas Weaver simply stared into his pint, as if hoping to find an answer in its murky depths. It was the Major, of course, who restored a semblance of order. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of the parade ground. "Nothing is to be touched. Mr. Gable, lock the front and back doors. Check all the windows. We must ensure no one has gotten in or out." While Silas Gable scurried to obey, the Major turned his attention to the room itself, his eyes sweeping over the assembled company with a newly suspicious glint. It is a curious thing how quickly a group of neighbors and acquaintances can transform into a collection of potential assassins. Each person now looked at the others with a fearful, questioning gaze. Who in this room possessed a heart black enough for murder? My own little grey cells, as a clever Belgian friend of mine is fond of calling them, were already beginning to churn. One must always begin with the facts, however few they may be. Fact 1, a man is dead. Fact 2, the weapon is a dart. Fact 3, we are all trapped together in this inn until the storm abates. The problem, therefore, was a closed one. The murderer was, beyond any reasonable doubt, one of us. "The dart," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence. Everyone turned to look at me, surprised, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "The flight is a most unusual colour, a very vivid green." Major Finch nodded curtly. "Indeed, I don't recognise it. They are not the house darts." He gestured to the set provided by the pub, which all had standard red or blue flights. "And they are certainly not mine. My own are fitted with navy blue flights, custom-ordered from London." He was a man who would, I felt certain, consider it a moral failing to use a dart that was not his own. Lillian Croft, the artist, let out a small choked sob. All eyes swiveled to her. "The green eye, I paint them myself," she stammered, wringing her hands. "It's a particular shade of viridian I mix, for luck. I had a set in my bag." She fumbled with a large canvas satchel, appending its contents onto a table. Out tumbled sketchbooks, charcoal sticks, a half-eaten apple, and a small leather case. She unzipped it. Inside, nestled in velvet slots, were 2 darts. Their flights were the same brilliant, venomous green as the one embedded in Arthur Pumble's neck. A 3rd slot was empty. "One is missing," she whispered, her face ashen. "He, Mr. Pumble, he was admiring them earlier. He called them gaudy things. He picked one up. I suppose he might have pocketed it as a joke." A likely story, or a convenient one. The girl was certainly flighty enough to be careless, but was she also clever enough to concoct such a tale? While the Major began a somewhat clumsy interrogation of the distraught artist, I allowed my gar. To drift back to the scene of the crime. One must never neglect the physical evidence. I rose from my chair, my knitting left forgotten, and approached the body with the quiet tread of one who has seen, alas, more than her fair share of human tragedy. I did not get too close, of course. I am well aware of the importance of not disturbing things. From a respectful distance I observed. Pumble had fallen backwards onto the settle. His right hand was clenched into a fist on the table, while his left hung limply at his side. The dart had entered the neck at a slightly downward angle, suggesting it had been thrown from a standing position by someone of average height. The force must have been considerable to have penetrated so deeply. My eyes scanned the floor around him, nothing but a few stray peanut shells and the sad, extinguished stump of his cigarillo. Then I saw it. On the cuff of his expensive tweed jacket near the left wrist was a small, dark smudge. It was not soot from the fire, nor was it ale. It looked to my eye very much like a smear of damp earth. Mud, a curious detail. The evening had been dry before the fog rolled in, and the path to the inn's front door was well paved. Where might one acquire a smudge of fresh mud on such a night? I was in the privy when the lights went out, Thomas Weaver stated flatly, his arms crossed over his chest. The Major had moved on to him. The window in there is naught but a slit, no man could get through it. And can anyone confirm this? The Major pressed. Weaver just grunted. The dog can. He was waiting for me outside the door. An unimpeachable witness, to be sure, but one not likely to be of much use in a court of law. Next came Mr. Shaw. He had, he insisted, been standing at the bar, about to order another whiskey. Gable was right there with me, and that salesman fellow Cole. We were all three of us at the far end of the bar. Sealers Gable nodded his confirmation, but his eyes avoided Shaw's. That's right, Mr. Cole was just telling me a rather long-winded story about a farmer and a prize-winning pig. Desmond Cole beamed, his cheerful demeanour seeming grotesque in the circumstances. A classic, the punchline is a corker. But alas, the darkness robbed me of my audience. A terrible business this, terrible, the poor man. I sold him 200 yards of the finest galvanized wire fencing only last week. A pleasure to do business with. A man who finds a murdered client a pleasure to do business with is either a fool or a very good actor. I filed Mr. Cole away for future consideration. It was when the Major turned his stern gaze upon Mrs. Gable that things became truly interesting. And you, madam, where were you? Beatrice Gable, who had been huddled behind the counter, started as if struck. Me, I was here, polishing the glasses. Her hands fluttered to her apron. I saw nothing, it was pitch black. Her voice was thin and reedy, but it was not her words that caught my attention. It was her husband. As she spoke, Sealers Gable shot her a look of pure, undiluted warning. It was a fleeting expression, there and gone in an instant, but it was unmistakable. The Gables were hiding something. But what? The Major, for all his bluster, was not a man for subtleties. He missed the look entirely and moved on. And so the initial round of questioning concluded, leaving us with a great deal of protestation and very little in the way of facts. Lillian Croft's dart was the weapon, but she claimed it was stolen. Several people had alibis of a sort. Everyone, it seemed, had a reason to dislike the victim. But a dislike for a man's character is one thing, the will to end his life is quite another. The bridge between the two is often built of secrets. Later that night, as we all sat in a strained and silent vigil in the main room, for no one dared to be alone, I observed a small, telling tableau. Beatrice Gable, believing herself unobserved, was sweeping the area around the dartboard. Her movements were frantic, almost desperate. As she swept near the oche, I saw her stoop and palm a tiny object from the floorboards. She glanced around furtively before slipping it into her apron pocket. It was too small for me to see clearly from my seat, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. Mrs. Gable had not been merely polishing glasses. The night wore on. The storm raged outside, rattling the window panes as if demanding entry. Inside, the silence was heavier still, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of, I suspect, more than one guilty heart. For I was quite certain of it now. The secret the Gables were hiding was directly connected to Arthur Pumble. And I had a strong suspicion that whatever Beatrice Gable had pocketed from the floor was a clue of the first importance. The question was, a clue to what? The little grey cells were working furiously. The picture was still maddeningly incomplete, like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But one must be patient. In my experience, when people are trapped with a secret, it has a way of wriggling its way out into the light. Chapter 3. By the following morning, the atmosphere in the Weary Wanderer had curdled from shock into a sour soup of suspicion and fear. The storm had not abated. If anything, the wind howled with greater fury, and the rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Our island had become a prison, and we, its inmates, were beginning to show the strain. Breakfast was a miserable affair. No one had much of an appetite, least of all for conversation. We sat scattered at separate tables, casting furtive glances at one another over our toast and lukewarm tea. The body of Arthur Pumble still lay on the settle, now decently covered with a checkered tablecloth, a silent, lumpen guest at our grim breakfast party. The Major had forbidden anyone from touching it further until the police, whenever they might arrive, could conduct a proper examination. It was clear that if any progress were to be made, a more methodical approach was required. The Major's blustering interrogations had yielded little. People, when frightened, will either say too much or too little. What was needed was not force, but finesse. I decided a change of scenery might prove useful. "Major," I said, catching his eye, "while it is imperative that the scene of the crime remains undisturbed, perhaps it would be wise to examine Mr. Pumble's room. The motive for this dreadful act may well be found amongst his personal effects." The Major considered this. "An excellent suggestion, Miss Vance, logical, methodical. We shall conduct a search." He immediately appointed himself leader of this expedition, of course. "Sure, you come with me, we need a witness." Gregory Shaw looked less than thrilled at the prospect, but knew better than to argue. As they tramped up the creaking staircase, a thought occurred to me. I turned to our host. "Mr. Gable," I said in a low voice, "I find I have left my travelling clock in my room. Would you be so kind as to fetch it for me? It is on the bedside table, room number 3. Silas Gable looked at me, his eyes full of a dull misery. "Of course, miss." He took a key from a hook behind the bar and disappeared up the stairs, his footsteps receding down the opposite corridor from the one the Major and Shaw had taken. This left me with a few precious moments alone with the person I most wished to speak to, Beatrice Gable. She was polishing a tankard with such ferocious energy, it was a wonder the pewter did not wear away. "Mrs. Gable," I began, gently approaching the bar, "this is a terrible ordeal for you." She jumped, startled, and the tankard clattered onto the counter. "It's a nightmare," she whispered, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Mr. Pumble," I continued, keeping my voice soft and confidential. He was not a kind man, was he? Her eyes filled with a sudden, surprising venom. "He was a monster, a cruel, wicked bully. He had some sort of hold over you, did he not?" The colour drained from her face. I don't know what you mean." "My dear," I said, my voice full of a sympathy I genuinely felt, for she seemed a creature tormented. "Last night I saw you pick something up from the floor by the dartboard, something you did not wish anyone else to see. One must ask oneself why." Tears began to trace paths down her pale cheeks. She wrung her hands in her apron, her knuckles white. He was blackmailing me, you see," she confessed in a rush of whispered words. "From a long time ago, before I met Silas. I was young and foolish, there was a bit of trouble. Nothing much, really, but Pumble knew of it. He grew up in the same town. When he moved here, he recognized me. He threatened to tell Silas to ruin our good name here. He wanted money, of course. And other things." Her voice broke on a sob. "Last night," she continued, "he cornered me by the kitchen door. He was drunk and pouring at me. I pushed him away and he stumbled. He tore my dress." She reached into her apron pocket and drew out her hand. On her palm lay a small mother-of-pearl button. It must have come off then. When I saw it on the floor after it happened, I was terrified. I thought everyone would think that you had a motive for killing him, I finished for her. She nodded miserably. And did you, Mrs. Gable? No, she cried, her voice rising before she clamped a hand over her mouth. I hated him. I wished him dead, God forgive me, but I didn't kill him. When the lights went out, I was right here behind the bar. I screamed. I believed her. Her fear seemed entirely genuine. She was a victim, not a perpetrator. But her story added another layer of darkness to the character of the deceased. Arthur Pumble was not just a boor. He was a blackmailer and a predator. This widened the field of potential suspects considerably. Justice, after all, can wear many faces. At that moment, the Major and Mr. Shaw descended the stairs, their faces grim. The door to Pumble's room has been forced, the Major announced gravely. The lock has been jimmied, quite crudely. And the room has been tossed. Tossed, I queried. Turned upside down, Shaw clarified, wiping his brow. Drawers pulled out, mattress overturned. Someone was looking for something, and they were in a desperate hurry. Silas Gable returned then, holding my clock. His face was a mask, but his hands trembled slightly. He had been gone, I calculated, just long enough to force a simple lock, conduct a hasty search and return. But was he searching for Beatrice's secret or one of his own? The focus of the investigation had now shifted. This was not merely a crime of passion, a dart thrown in a moment of drunken fury. It was something more. Someone had wanted Arthur Pumble dead, and someone, perhaps the same person, perhaps not, had wanted something he possessed. I let my gaze wander around the room, reassessing each of my fellow prisoners. Thomas Weaver still sat silently, but his earlier, simmering rage now seemed more like a deep, abiding sorrow. What if Pumble's threat to his farm was more serious than a simple dispute over a stream? Lillian Croft was sketching furiously in her book, her charcoal flying across the page. Was she capturing the scene or exorcising a demon? Gregory Shaw could no longer keep still, his pacing wearing a path in the flagstones. A business deal gone wrong could certainly be a motive for murder, and for the recovery of an incriminating document. And Desmond Cole, the cheerful salesman, was attempting to engage Mrs. Gable in a light-hearted conversation about the weather, an effort so jarringly inappropriate that it seemed less cheerful and more unhinged. Then there was the mud. The small smudge on Pumble's cuff, it still bothered me. I walked to the back door of the inn, which Mr. Gable had locked as instructed. A small, grimy window in the door looked out onto the yard. The inn's generator was housed in a small, dilapidated brick shed about 20 yards from the back door. The ground between the two was a churned-up mess of mud and wet grass. The main power went out first, and then the generator kicked in, I mused aloud, mostly to myself. That's right, said the Major, who had followed me. Gable's wiring is a disgrace. Happens all the time, he says. But someone has to start the generator, do they not? It is not fully automatic, I take it. Silas Gable, who was nearby, shook his head. No, miss, there's a switch in the shed. When the mains go, one of us has to go out and flip it. And who did so last night? I asked. I did, he said. As soon as the lights went out, I went through the kitchen, out the back and into the shed. It only took a moment. A moment in the dark. A moment to dash out to a muddy shed. My eyes drifted back to the smudge on the dead man's cuff. It was a small thing, a tiny inconsistency. But it is upon such tiny things that the truth so often turns. The mud suggested that either Mr. Gable had encountered Pumble in the brief moments of darkness, or someone else had made that same muddy journey to the generator shed. Someone who had a reason to ensure the lights went out at a very specific moment. Chapter 4. The day dragged on, each hour stretching into an eternity of suspicion. The forced intimacy of our confinement was becoming unbearable. Every conversation was stilted, every glance freighted with meaning. We were like scorpions in a bottle, circling one another warily, waiting for the sting. I decided to seek out the young artist, Lillian Croft. I found her in her corner, her sketchbook open on her lap. She was not sketching the dour faces of her fellow captives, however. She was drawing Dartmoor ponies, dozens of them, their manes flying in a wild, imaginary wind. They were drawings of escape. "Your dart, Miss Croft," I began, sitting opposite her. "You are quite certain Mr. Pumble took it from you?" She looked up, her large, dark eyes full of a hunted expression. "Yes, I am. He was a horrid man. He saw me painting them at the table, a new set I'd just finished. He said, 'What's a little girl like you doing with toys like these?' He picked one up and wouldn't give it back. He slipped it into his pocket. I was too intimidated to ask for it back. So you did not, for instance, give it to someone else?" I pressed gently. "As a gift or a favor?" A flicker of something, was it confusion or deceit, passed through her eyes. "No, of course not. Why would I?" "Ah, but why indeed?" That was the question. Her denial was perhaps a little too quick, a little too vehement. I had the distinct impression that Miss Croft was not telling the entire truth. Perhaps Pumble did not take the dart. Perhaps she had given it away and was now terrified of the implication that she had, however innocently, provided the murder weapon. My attention was next drawn to a quiet but intense discussion between Major Finch and Mr. Shaw. They were standing by the window, their heads closed together. The Major, it seemed, had found a new purpose. Having failed to solve the crime by immediate interrogation, he had now taken to re-examining the timeline with military precision. "So the lights went out at approximately 9:17, he was saying, consulting his pocket watch as if it had recorded the event. "Gable claims he went immediately to the generator. Let's grant him 90 seconds for the round trip in the dark and rain. The lights were restored at, let's say, 9:19. That leaves a window of 2 minutes. Ample time for our culprit to act." "And what about the search of his room?" Shaw asked, his voice low and tight. "When did that happen?" "It must have been after the murder," the Major reasoned. "Otherwise the killer would have had what he wanted and might not have needed to proceed. No, the murder came first. Then, sometime during the night, as we all sat here like lemons, the killer slipped away and forced the lock." Their logic seemed sound as far as it went, but it was based on a series of assumptions, and assumptions, in my experience, are the mother of all error. They assumed the searcher and the killer were one and the same. They assumed the murder was the primary objective. What if it was the other way around? What if the murder was merely a diversion, a means to create the opportunity for the search? It was a possibility that could not be discounted. I left them to their theorizing and sought a moment with the cheerful Mr. Cole. He was, I had noted, the only person in the inn who seemed entirely unaffected by the grim proceedings. He was polishing his spectacles, humming a Jones tune under his breath. "Mr. Cole," I said, "you mentioned you had recently concluded a business deal with Mr. Pumble." "That's right, my dear lady," he boomed, his smile unwavering. "Sold him a fine quantity of fencing for that new estate of his. Top of the line, paid right on the nail too. A shame what's happened, a genuine shame." "You travel a great deal in this area, do you not?" I asked. "You must know a great many of the local people." "Oh, I know them all," he declared proudly. "From the richest landowner to the humblest shepherd, Desmond Cole knows their business. What they need, what they want, what they worry about. It's the secret to good salesmanship, you see, knowing the people." "Then you must have known the Weavers for some time," I ventured. "Thomas, the farmer here, and his family." For the first time, a shadow crossed Desmond Cole's sunny face. It was there for only a second, a brief clouding of the eyes, but it was there. "The Weavers," he said, his voice a touch quieter. "Yes, a long time, a fine family. Salt of the earth, had their share of troubles though, more than their share." "Troubles?" I prompted. He seemed to regret his momentary lapse. His smile snapped back into place. "Oh, you know, farming is a hard life, ups and downs. Prices change, weather turns, the usual struggles. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must see if Mrs. Gable can spare a cup of tea. A throat gets terribly dry with all this excitement." He bustled away, leaving me to ponder his strange, fleeting reaction. He knew the Weavers, and their troubles were something more than the usual struggles of a farmer. What could it be, and what possible connection could it have to a London property developer with a taste for tweed and cruelty? The pieces were swirling, but a coherent picture refused to form. We had a blackmailed landlady, a resentful farmer, a nervous businessman, and a frightened artist who had supplied the weapon. We had a forced door and a desperate search for an unknown object. We had a timeline of 2 minutes in the dark. And we had a smudge of mud and a salesman who knew more than he was letting on. It was then that another small, seemingly insignificant memory floated to the surface of my mind. It was from the darts game, just before the end. Pumble, in his arrogance, had been mocking the Major's meticulous aim. All that precision, he'd sneered, and for what? You need a bit of instinct, a bit of fire, like our friend here. And he had clapped Thomas Weaver on the shoulder, a gesture of condescension that had made the farmer flinch. Strong as an ox, this one. I bet he could throw a dart clean through that bloody board if he put his mind to it. A throwaway comment, a drunkard's taunt, but he was right. Weaver, with his powerful farmer's physique, certainly had the strength. And the Major, for all his rigidity, had the skill. Desmond Cole, too. One could see from his build that he had likely spent many an hour in pubs like this one. He probably had a decent arm himself, and Mr. Shaw, with his nervous energy, might be surprisingly forceful. The darkness, I realized, was the key. It was not just an opportunity, it was a cloak. It rendered the skill of a marksman like the Major almost irrelevant. In the pitch black, one could not aim in the traditional sense. A throw would be based on memory, on instinct, on one's position relative to the board just moments before. But what if the thrower was not aiming for the board at all? What if they were aiming for a sound, the sound of a man's boorish, drunken voice? Pumble had been talking right up until the moment the lights failed. He had provided a perfect audio target. The killer did not need to see, they only needed to listen. Chapter 5. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, painting the edges of the raging storm clouds in bruised shades of purple and grey, the tension within the weary wanderer reached a breaking point. Nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. A dropped spoon caused Lillian Croft to shriek, and a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the inn's very foundations made Gregory Shaw cry out. The Major, Shaw, and Thomas Weaver had formed a grim, silent cabal, convinced that the killer was Sealer's Gable. They pointed to his access to the fuse box, his opportunity during the blackout, and his shifty demeanor. They saw his search of Pumble's room as an attempt to find and destroy whatever evidence the blackmailer held over his wife. It was a plausible theory, built on a foundation of observable fact and reasonable conjecture. And it was, I was almost certain, entirely wrong. It is a common mistake in the investigation of a crime, my dear reader, to seize upon the most obvious solution. The human mind craves order and simplicity, and is often too eager to fit the jagged pieces of reality into a neat, satisfying picture. But murder is rarely neat, and the truth is seldom simple. I knew I could wait no longer. To allow this erroneous suspicion to fester would be dangerous. An innocent man might be harmed, and the true culprit would be free to cover their tracks, or worse. It was time to arrange the facts, to lay them out one by one, and to allow the sheer, unassailable weight of logic to reveal the pattern that lay hidden beneath. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice clear and firm, causing all conversation to cease. "I believe it would be beneficial for us all to gather around the fire. There are matters which we must discuss, openly and honestly." Reluctantly they complied, drawn by the undeniable force of a new authority in the room. They arranged themselves in a semicircle of chairs, their faces pale and anxious in the flickering firelight. The covered form on the settle served as a silent, grim observer to our proceedings. "There is a belief among some of you," I began, my eyes moving from the Major to Shaw to Weaver, "that our host, Mr. Gable, is responsible for this crime. You believe he cut the power, used the darkness to kill Mr. Pumble, and later searched his room to protect his wife. Is this a fair summary?" The Major grunted his assent. "It is a logical deduction," I conceded. "But it is based on a false premise. It does not account for all the facts. Most notably, it does not account for the mud." I saw a flicker of confusion in their eyes. "The mud," Shaw repeated. "Indeed." the smudge of damp earth on the victim's cuff. "Mr. Gable," I said, turning to him, "you went to the generator shed. Your boots would have been muddy, it is true. But how would that mud have transferred to Mr. Pumble's cuff when he was inside the inn and you were outside? We might have brushed against each other in the dark," Sealers mumbled, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Unlikely," I countered. "You moved from behind the bar towards the back door. He was standing by the fireplace, a considerable distance away. No, the mud tells a different story. It tells us that Mr. Pumble had a close encounter with someone who had been to the generator shed. And that person was not you, Mr. Gable. The person who tampered with the generator to create the blackout, the person who made that muddy walk, was the murderer." I paused, letting the implication settle. The murder was premeditated. The blackout was not a happy accident for the killer. It was a tool as carefully chosen as the dart itself. I turned my attention to Lillian Croft. "Miss Croft, you have been most distressed, and for that I sympathize. But you have not been entirely truthful with us. You did not have the dart stolen from you by Mr. Pumble, did you? You gave it to someone." The girl burst into tears. I didn't know," she wailed. "He was so kind to me. He admired my artwork, he told me I had real talent. He said he was a keen darts player himself and loved the unique flights. He asked if he could have one, as a memento of his visit to the moors. I was flattered. I gave it to him yesterday afternoon. How could I have known? He," the Major barked. "Who?" My gaze shifted, moving past the artist, past the innkeepers, and settled upon the one man whose composure had remained unnervingly intact. The one man who had wrapped himself in a cloak of such relentless good cheer that it had rendered him almost invisible. "You, Mr. Cole," I said quietly. "She gave the dart to you." Desmond Cole's broad, pink face seemed to collapse. The smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. "Me, my dear lady, that is absurd. I am a travelling salesman, not a murderer." "Are you?" I pressed. "Or is that merely a convenient role? A way to travel the country, to listen in public houses, to gather information without raising suspicion? You told me yourself, you make it your business to know everyone. You told me you knew the Weavers, and that they had their troubles." I looked at Thomas Weaver, whose craggy face was a mask of confusion. "Mr. Weaver, your family has farmed here for generations. But you are not the only Weaver in this part of Devon, are you?" He shook his head slowly. "I have cousins over near Tavistock, and one of them perhaps had a wife," I asked softly. "A young wife who was killed many years ago." The farmer's face hardened into a granite slab of grief. "Aye," he breathed. "Sarah taken from us. A hit-and-run on the Tavistock Road. The driver was never found. Drunk, they said, in a fancy motor car. He left her on the road to die." My heart ached for him, but I had to continue. I turned back to the man who was no longer smiling. "The driver was never brought to justice, but the family knew who it was, didn't they? A wealthy, arrogant man with enough influence to make the problem disappear. A man named Arthur Pumble." A collective gasp went through the room. "Sarah's husband was a quiet, gentle man," I went on, the final pieces clicking into place with a terrible, tragic certainty. "He was destroyed by her death, and by the injustice of it all. He left the farm, left the area. He changed his life, but he never changed his purpose. He spent years searching for the man who had ruined his life. He took a job that would allow him to travel, to ask questions, and finally, after all those years, he found him. Here. At this inn," I looked directly at the salesman. "Your name is not Desmond Cole. That is not your real life. Your name is Daniel Weaver. And you came here not to sell fencing, but to exact a vengeance you have nursed for half a lifetime." The man, Daniel Weaver, did not speak. He simply stared at me, his face a ruin, the jovial mask stripped away to reveal a well of profound, bottomless grief. "You planned it all so carefully," I narrated, the events of the previous night now horribly clear. "You acquired the untraceable weapon from Miss Croft. You knew of the faulty wiring in this old inn from your many visits. Before the game, you slipped out the back and tampered with the generator switch. arranging it so that you could kill the main power from the fuse box inside, knowing the generator would not automatically start. You left that muddy trail. During the game, you waited for your moment. You flipped the main switch by the bar, plunging us into darkness. In the ensuing confusion, you moved from your position. Pumble was still talking, a perfect target in the black. You threw the dart. You are an expert player, I have no doubt. And then you slipped back to your place at the bar. You created your alibi with Mr. Gable in the seconds after the murder had been committed. And the search, the Major demanded, his voice hoarse. Was that you too? Daniel Weaver finally shook his head, a slight, weary movement. No, a new voice said, a voice filled with grim resolution. It was Major Finch. That was me. All eyes turned to him. I served with Daniel's father, the Major said, his ramrod posture seeming to slump for the first time. I knew the story of what happened to his wife. When I saw him here, I recognized him, and I suspected his purpose. After the murder, I could not be certain, but I thought it must be him. Pumble was known to keep trophies of his conquests. I thought there might be some proof in his room, something that belonged to the girl. I forced the door, looking for it, to help the boy, to see that justice in its own way was done. He looked at Daniel Weaver, a deep, sad understanding in his eyes. He delivered a sentence that was long overdue. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. The puzzle was solved. Every piece fit. The unique dart, the engineered blackout, the mud on the cuff from when Daniel retrieved the dart from Pumble's neck in the dark, to ensure it couldn't be traced back to the set, the forced door, the salesman's hidden past. Daniel Weaver slowly rose to his feet. He did not look angry or frightened. He looked only tired, as if a great and terrible weight had finally been set down. He took everything from me, he said, his voice hollow but clear. For years, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that fancy motorcar driving away. He never even looked back. He looked around at the stunned faces of his fellow captives. I am not sorry that he is dead. I am only sorry that it took me so long. At that moment, as if on cue, a faint, rhythmic sound penetrated the roar of the storm. It was the sound of a powerful engine growing steadily closer. The blue flashing lights of a police vehicle painted a strobing, unearthly glow through the fog-bound windows. The storm was ending. Our isolation was over. But as the heavy tread of official footsteps approached the door, I looked at the faces in the firelight. The murderer, the avenger, the grieving farmer, the protector. Justice had been done of a kind. But the law would demand its own different price. I picked up my knitting once more, the familiar weight of the needles a small comfort in a world where the lines between right and wrong had become so terribly, irrevocably blurred. The human heart, I reflected, will always be the greatest mystery of all.